Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Today, we're diving into the sometimes choppy, often unpredictable waters of U.S.-Russia relations.
A relationship, you could say, that's had an outsized impact on global affairs.
Absolutely. We're going to navigate from the end of the Soviet Union all the way to the conflict that's going on right now in Ukraine. And along the way, we'll look at the big events and agreements that have kind of brought us to this point.
Yeah, it's a history with moments of hope and times when the two countries actually work together.
Right.
But it's also a history of really deep mistrust and maybe some missed opportunities.
So let's start our exploration right after the Soviet Union collapsed. It felt, at the time, like a moment with a real chance for a whole new global order.
1991, it really was a turning point. I mean, the Soviet Union, a superpower, right, one that had rivaled the United States, it dissolved.
Yeah.
And in its place, you had 15 brand new independent states. And all of them, they were trying to figure out how to make this transition to democracy and to market economies.
And the U.S. at this moment saw a real opportunity to reshape the global landscape.
You know, the idea in Washington was that if the U.S. helped Russia through this transition, then maybe they could stop new threats from popping up, and maybe even bring Russia into the kind of the Western-led international order.
So that thinking, that belief is what led to a whole bunch of initiatives, right, aimed at supporting Russia's transition. What were some of the key efforts that the U.S. made back then?
So the U.S. had this multifaceted approach. They provided financial aid, they encouraged democratic reforms, and they worked on cooperative security programs. For example, like the U.S., it kind of took the lead in creating this thing called the International Science and Technology Center.
Okay.
And it was in Moscow and in Kiev. And the idea behind it was to give those former Soviet weapons scientists, to give them jobs, civilian jobs, so they wouldn't, proliferate this sensitive knowledge.
It sounds like a very practical, pragmatic approach to deal with the risk of all this sensitive expertise that's suddenly out there. Were there other programs that focused on mitigating those risks from the Soviet collapse?
Yeah, there was one called the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program.
Right.
It started in 1991, and Senators Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar, they led this bipartisan effort, and it focused on securing and then dismantling weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, all across the former Soviet Union.
And this program, it involved a lot of cooperation between American and Russian experts, right? Even with all those Cold War suspicions that were still hanging around.
Yeah, Nunn-Lugar, it was a real testament to how countries can cooperate even when they really don't trust each other that much. You had these American experts right there working side by side with Russians, and they were securing nuclear warheads, dismantling the delivery systems, setting up safe storage, that kind of thing.
It's really something to see how even just after the Cold War ended, both sides knew that nuclear proliferation was a big threat, and they were willing to work together, to deal with it.
It's an important point, yeah, because while the U.S. and Russia, I mean, they were still rivals geopolitically,
Sure.
They also knew they had to work together on certain things. But even with all the successes of Nunn-Lugar, it couldn't really solve those deeper tensions, those insecurities that were starting to come back.
And we saw that sense of resentment started to grow inside Russia, right?
Yeah.
How did this resentment show itself, and what caused it?
Well, Russia was going through these economic reforms. And while the reforms were probably necessary in the long run for development, the way they were put in place, it was often chaotic, corrupt. And so you had a lot of economic hardship, people's lives were disrupted, and many Russians felt humiliated.
The way things were privatized so quickly, I mean, state assets, it created this class of oligarchs who became super wealthy.
Right.
And at the same time, so many everyday Russians were just struggling to survive.
Exactly. And the economic turmoil of the 90s, it left a real scar, and it became this breeding ground for nationalism and anti-Western feelings.
And that sense of grievance, right? The feeling that the West had treated Russia unfairly during this vulnerable period, that really played a big role in shaping Russia's foreign policy in the years that followed.
Oh, absolutely. In Russia, the 90s, they're often seen as a decade of lost chances, like a national decline. And that story, that narrative, it came from the economic hardships and also from those perceived slights from the West.
Yeah.
And it all fed into this growing resentment and this desire to make Russia a big player on the world stage again.
And this desire that you're talking about, this desire to be a major power again, It brings us to another really important point of contention between the U.S. and Russia. NATO's expansion to the east. Can you talk about how that issue created tension between the two countries?
So NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, it was set up in 1949, and it was mostly about containing the Soviet Union, stopping communism from spreading in Europe.
Right.
And after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was this big question. What's NATO's purpose now? What's its relationship with Russia going to be? And that became a major, major sticking point.
And if I remember correctly, there were people in the U.S. foreign policy world, they really debated whether NATO should expand eastward, like bringing in those former Warsaw Pact countries and even former Soviet republics.
Right. So the people who were for NATO expansion, they said it was necessary. They said you had to give these newly independent states in Central and Eastern Europe, you had to give them security guarantees, protect them from possible Russian aggression. They said a bigger NATO, it would mean more stability and security for everyone in Europe.
But not everyone agreed with that, right?
Yeah.
What were the counter arguments to expanding NATO?
The folks who were against it, they said it would make Russia feel alienated, like it was a betrayal of the cooperation that, was supposed to define this post-Cold War era.
Right.
They warned that expanding NATO right up to Russia's borders, that would feel like a threat to Moscow.
Sure.
Like it would provoke them, maybe lead to a hostile response, and just completely undermine all those efforts to build a good relationship.
And as we know now, those concerns, they turned out to be pretty accurate.
Yeah.
Russia really opposed NATO expansion. They saw it as an encroachment on their sphere of influence and a direct threat to their own security interests.
Yeah, Moscow's argument was that the West hadn't kept its promises that were supposedly made during German reunification. They said Soviet leaders were told that NATO wouldn't expand eastward. But the U.S. and its allies, they said, no. There was never a formal commitment like that.
And that difference in perception, that fundamental disagreement about whether NATO expansion was even legitimate, it became a major, major obstacle in U.S.-Russia relations.
It really did. And the whole debate around NATO expansion, it just shows you how deep that mistrust was between the U.S. and Russia, even when it seemed like they were cooperating. That mistrust was always there.
Yeah.
It was fueled by old grudges, by different interpretations of past agreements, and that mistrust would have serious consequences for how their relationship developed.
And against this background of mistrust and those diverging security interests, we come to a pivotal moment in the history of U.S.-Russia relations, the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. And it's also a key factor in the conflict that's happening now in Ukraine.
Yeah, that memorandum, it came out of a very unique set of circumstances after the Soviet Union fell apart. Ukraine, they ended up with a big chunk of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. I mean, they had the third largest nuclear stockpile in the world.
And of course, that raised a lot of concerns internationally, especially, about the security risks of a brand new independent country with that many nuclear weapons.
It was a very uncertain situation. The U.S., Russia, the United Kingdom, they all knew how dangerous it was, and they put a lot of diplomatic pressure on Ukraine to get them to give up those nuclear weapons. And all those efforts, they led to the Budapest Memorandum, which was signed on December 5th, 1994.
Can you explain, the main points of the memorandum and the security assurances that it gave to Ukraine?
So, under the memorandum, Ukraine agreed to sign the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT.
Right.
And they'd be a non-nuclear weapons state. So that meant they'd dismantle their whole arsenal and send all their nuclear warheads to Russia so they could be dismantled.
And in exchange for that huge concession, they got security assurances from the three nuclear powers, right?
Mm-hmm.
The United States, the United Kingdom, and most importantly, Russia.
Exactly. The countries that signed the memorandum, they pledged to respect Ukraine's independence, its sovereignty, and its existing borders.
Right.
And they promised not to threaten or use force against Ukraine and not to use economic pressure to influence their political choices.
And it's important to remember that these promises, they weren't written into some legally binding treaty. It was more of a political declaration.
Mm.
And that difference would become really significant in the years to come.
It is a very important distinction, you're right, because they didn't have this legally binding mechanism. So the security assurances that Ukraine got, they relied on those countries actually being willing to keep their word, on their good faith,
Mm-hmm.
and relying on those political promises instead of something enforceable legally. It would have huge consequences for Ukraine's security down the road when they face new challenges.
as we keep going deeper into U.S.-Russia relations and all the things that led up to the current conflict, we'll see just how important the promises made in the Budapest Memorandum were, and of course the actions or inactions of the countries that signed it. They all played a huge role in shaping this very complicated geopolitical drama.
Yeah. The Budapest Memorandum, it reminds us that security guarantees are fragile if you don't have a strong way to enforce them. And it shows us how hard it is to navigate those complex relationships between geopolitics, national interests, and international law. When the promises in that memorandum unraveled, it had a profound impact on Ukraine's fate and on the whole international order. But even with the Budapest Memorandum, it didn't really, get rid of those deep anxieties that Russia had about its security and its place in the region. And that brings us to this idea of the near abroad, which was really important in shaping what Russia did in the years before this current conflict.
Yeah, the near abroad, it refers to those former Soviet republics, right?
Yeah.
The ones that became independent after the Soviet Union fell apart, but they're still so closely connected to Russia, both geographically and culturally.
Right.
So can you explain a little more about where this near abroad policy came from and what Russia was hoping to achieve with it?
It kind of emerged in the early 90s when Russia was still trying to understand what the collapse of the Soviet Union really meant.
Sure.
They had lost their superpower status. And the near abroad policy, it reflected this desire to hold on to some influence, some leverage over those newly independent states, because Moscow saw them as crucial for its security and for its economic interests.
And Russia's concerns, they came from a mix of historical factors, geopolitical factors, and economic factors too, right?
Right. Exactly. Historically, Russia has always viewed these territories as part of its sphere of influence. I mean, it goes way back to the Russian Empire and then, of course, the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, those long-standing ties, they were disrupted, and it made Moscow feel vulnerable, uncertain strategically.
And geopolitically, Russia saw the near abroad as this kind of buffer zone, right? Like a protective layer between itself and potential enemies.
Exactly. Russia didn't want the West, especially NATO, to expand its influence into these former Soviet republics.
Right.
They saw the West's involvement there as an attempt to contain Russia to weaken its regional power.
And the economic side of it, that was really important too, right? Many of those former Soviet republics, they depended heavily on Russia for their energy and for trade. And that gave Moscow a lot of economic power.
You're absolutely right. Russia wanted to keep those countries economically dependent. They used their control over energy resources to influence things politically, to make sure their interests in the region were protected. And they pushed for economic integration using these regional organizations like the Eurasian Economic Union to strengthen their ties with those countries.
So Russia wanted to maintain this influence in the near abroad. And to do that, they used a whole range of tools and tactics, right?
Right.
What were some of the main ways that they tried to exert their influence in these countries?
They used a combination of soft power and hard power.
Okay.
With friendly regimes, they would use their economic leverage. They would provide subsidized energy, offer preferential trade agreements.
Right.
They also put a lot of money into cultural diplomacy, promoting the Russian language and culture, and, reminding everyone of those shared historical ties.
But Russia also used more forceful measures when they thought they needed to, right?
Yeah, when it came to protecting their interests or stopping what they saw as threats to their security, Russia showed they were willing to use military force. They got involved in several conflicts in the near abroad, like the war in Georgia in 2008, and of course, the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine.
And Russia's backing of those separatist movements in Moldova and Georgia, and even their military intervention in Syria, those are all examples of how Russia was willing to project its power beyond its borders and to push back against Western influence in areas that they considered strategically important.
Yeah, and if you look at those actions in the context of their near-abroad policy, it really highlights how assertive their foreign policy had become,
Right.
They were determined to remain the dominant force in the region, and they were willing to use all sorts of tools to get what they wanted: economics, politics, and military power.
And this brings us to Ukraine, which has become, the main focal point of this conflict between Russia and the West. What was it about Ukraine that made it such a flashpoint in this geopolitical struggle?
Well, Ukraine, it holds a really unique and strategically important position in the near abroad. I mean, it shares this long border with Russia, right?
Yeah.
And historically, it's served as this kind of bridge between Russia and Europe. And because it controls key transit routes for Russian gas going to Europe, it has a lot of economic clout.
And you can't forget about those cultural and linguistic ties between Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah.
They're really significant. A big portion of Ukraine's population speaks Russian,
Yeah.
and there are those deep historical and religious connections between the two countries.
And Russia has definitely used those cultural and linguistic ties to try and advance their interests in Ukraine.
Yeah.
They've supported pro-Russian political parties and media outlets, and they've used propaganda to try to create divisions and to undermine Ukrainian national unity.
But Ukraine, it also has these strong ties with Europe, right? Especially the Western regions. Historically, they've looked toward Europe, and a lot of Ukrainians, they really want to integrate with the West. But that desire kind of clashed with Russia's determination to keep Ukraine under its influence.
Yeah, that's right. And this clash of aspirations, this tug of war between Russia and the West over Ukraine's future, that's what set the stage for what happened in 2013 and 2014, which eventually led to the conflict we're seeing now.
So those Euromaidan protests, they started in Kyiv in November 2013, and they were a real turning point for Ukraine and for its relationship with Russia. What were the main things that triggered those protests, and how did they escalate into this full-blown crisis?
The protests, they were sparked by President Viktor Yanukovych. He decided to suspend all the preparations for this association agreement with the European Union.
Right.
And, that agreement, a lot of Ukrainians saw it as a way to get closer to Europe. They had been negotiating it for years.
Yeah.
And when Yanukovych made that decision, a lot of people felt like he had betrayed their hopes for a European future, especially because he did it under pressure from Russia.
Right.
Right? It caused outrage. And it sparked these protests, initially led by students and activists. And what they wanted was closer ties with Europe, an end to corruption, and an end to authoritarian rule. And these protests, they became known as the Euromaidan movement, and they grew really fast. I mean, you had hundreds of thousands of people from all over Ukraine taking part.
And the government, they responded to those protests with a pretty violent crackdown, which just made things worse, right?
Oh, absolutely. The violence just kept escalating. And in February 2014, over 100 protesters were killed. They're known as the Heavenly 100. And their deaths, they shocked the nation, and they led to Yanukovych being ousted from power. He ended up fleeing to Russia.
And Russia, seeing all of this happening in Ukraine, they saw it as a direct threat to their interests, and they responded very quickly and decisively.
Yeah, and they did something that really surprised the international community. They took control of the Crimean Peninsula.
Right.
It's a strategically important territory with a majority Russian population. And then they quickly organized a referendum, which most of the West saw as illegitimate, to justify annexing Crimea.
Annexing Crimea was a clear violation of international law. It was a direct challenge to the post-Cold War order. It was a turning point in Russia's relationship with the West, and it ushered in this new era of confrontation and mistrust.
And it didn't stop there. Russia also instigated and then supported a separatist uprising in eastern Ukraine. They gave weapons, money, and military advisors to pro-Russian separatist groups in the Donbas region.
And that conflict has been going on for over 8 years now.
Yeah.
Over 14,000 people have died. Millions more have been displaced. It's become this frozen conflict with no end in sight. And it's a constant source of tension between Russia and the West.
And, the conflict in eastern Ukraine, it was like a preview of the full-scale invasion that happened in February 2022. Because remember, Russia was behind it. They were supporting those separatist forces.
And that invasion, that was a huge escalation of the conflict. It's thrown Europe into its worst security crisis since World War II. And the consequences, they've been felt all over the world.
Yeah, the invasion really was a turning point. It changed Russia's relationship with Ukraine, but it also changed its relationship with the West. It led to those unprecedented sanctions against Russia. It led to Western countries giving even more military support to Ukraine, and it brought this renewed focus on European security.
And the U.S., being the leader of the Western Alliance, they've really played a central role in shaping the response to Russia's aggression.
Yeah, their response has been multifaceted. There's been diplomacy, economic sanctions, military aid to Ukraine, and they've also been trying to bolster NATO's defenses in Eastern Europe. And all of that shows how serious the situation is.
Yeah.
And it shows the need to deter Russia from being aggressive, to make sure it doesn't happen again, while also supporting Ukraine's right to defend itself.
This conflict in Ukraine, it's given the U.S. a really complex set of challenges. They're trying to find that balance between supporting Ukraine, deterring Russia, and avoiding a wider conflict, one that could be catastrophic.
And the U.S. response, it's been shaped by a bunch of different factors, things like domestic politics, geopolitical necessities, economic realities, and moral obligations. And each of these, they offer a really important perspective on how complicated this situation is.
Let's dive into each of those dimensions, starting with the domestic political landscape in the U.S. How has this conflict played out in American politics, and how has it affected public opinion?
Yeah, it's definitely tested the strength of the transatlantic alliance, and here in the U.S., it's sparked debate about how involved we should be. You see a lot of bipartisan support in Congress, for helping Ukraine and stopping Russia from being aggressive, but some people are worried about things escalating and about the economic burden of supporting Ukraine for a long time.
Yeah, it's a tough balance, right? I mean, on the one hand, you want to support a democratic country that's being attacked. But on the other hand, there's that very real risk of escalating things with a country that has nuclear weapons.
Right. And you can't ignore public opinion either. It plays a role in how the U.S. responds. A lot of Americans feel sympathy for Ukraine, but the level of support for different kinds of assistance, that varies. Some people think humanitarian aid should be the priority. Others think we need to give more military support. And then there are people who are, worried about what this conflict is doing to the economy, like rising energy prices and inflation.
It's messy. There aren't any easy answers here.
Yeah.
So let's shift gears a bit and talk about the geopolitical factors that have influenced the U.S. response.
Well, the U.S., they see what's happening in Ukraine as a direct challenge to that rules-based international order. What Russia's done, especially taking Crimea and then invading, it just goes against those basic principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity.
So it's bigger than just supporting Ukraine.
Yeah.
The U.S. response is about defending those principles that have kept things relatively stable around the world for decades.
Exactly. The U.S., they feel like they have to deter this kind of aggression from happening again, and not just in Ukraine. A failure to respond and to respond strongly, well, it might make other authoritarian regimes bolder,
Sure.
and that could undermine the whole international order.
And this conflict has really shown how important alliances are, especially NATO.
Absolutely. The U.S. has said very clearly that they're committed to defending their NATO allies. And to show that, they've increased their military presence in Eastern Europe. Plus, they're giving a lot of military aid to Ukraine. It's all about reassuring allies, strengthening collective defense, and showing that they're united against what Russia's doing.
And NATO's Article 5, that collective defense clause, it's invoked a few times since NATO was founded in 1949, but usually it was in response to terrorism, like the September 11th attacks, not really in the context of a conflict between states.
Yeah, Ukraine presents this really tricky dilemma for NATO because while they really want to help Ukraine, they also know that if they get directly involved militarily, it could make the conflict much, much worse. So the U.S. has been careful. They're supporting Ukraine, but they're avoiding anything that Russia might see as a direct military confrontation.
And then there's the economic side of the U.S. response. That's a big part of it, too. The U.S. working with its allies, they've put these really unprecedented sanctions on Russia. Targeting their key industries, their financial institutions, and even individuals who are close to the Kremlin.
The sanctions, they're meant to really hurt Russia's economy, to make it harder for them to pay for the war. The goal is to put so much pressure on the Russian government that they change course.
Right.
But sanctions, they always have unintended consequences. They hurt the global economy, too. They cause energy prices to go up, and they disrupt supply chains.
And because the global economy is so interconnected, those sanctions, they have ripple effects that go way beyond Russia. The U.S. and its allies, they've tried to lessen those effects, but they know there are costs that come with this economic pressure campaign.
Absolutely. And the situation has really exposed how dependent Europe is on Russia for energy, especially natural gas.
Yeah.
And that's why they're trying to find different sources of energy to become less reliant on Russia. But it's shown us how vulnerable global supply chains are, and it's underlined the need for them to be more resilient.
And then, beyond the geopolitical and economic aspects, there's also this moral imperative that's shaping how the U.S. is responding. Those images of civilian suffering, the destruction, the millions of people displaced, it's really galvanized public opinion, and it's strengthened the resolve to support Ukraine.
Yeah, the U.S. has framed their support for Ukraine in moral terms. They emphasize the right of the Ukrainian people to decide their own fate, to defend their democracy against an authoritarian aggressor, and they've given a lot of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, and they've supported those neighboring countries that are that are dealing with this influx of refugees.
And, this conflict has brought back those discussions about nuclear nonproliferation, especially because Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons under that Budapest Memorandum.
It definitely has. What happened to Ukraine, it raises some serious questions about whether security assurances actually work, and about what might happen to other countries if they decide to give up their nuclear weapons. Some people say that what's happening in Ukraine might make other countries less likely to pursue disarmament in the future, while others say that this crisis actually shows how important it is to strengthen those international non-proliferation efforts.
So there are really strong arguments on both sides of this issue. Can we break down those arguments a bit? Like, what are the potential benefits and risks of different policy options?
So one of the main arguments for supporting Ukraine is that it upholds international law and that it deters future aggression. The people who believe this, they say that if Russia's allowed to get away with this invasion, it sets a dangerous precedent. It tells other countries that they can just change borders by force.
Right.
And they argue that if we don't take strong action, it could lead to a much more unstable and unpredictable world, and that could have huge consequences for global security.
Yeah, I mean, the stakes are pretty high.
And another benefit of supporting Ukraine is that it strengthens alliances, especially NATO. The conflict has shown how important collective defense is and the need for a credible deterrent against potential enemies.
But there are also those concerns, right? Concerns about the risks that come with the current approach. And one of the biggest worries is that things could escalate.
Right. The U.S. is walking a very fine line here. They're trying to help Ukraine defend itself without starting a bigger conflict with Russia. And remember, Russia has nuclear weapons.
And the possibility of a miscalculation or something unintended happening, that's a constant worry.
Yeah, if there was a direct military confrontation between NATO and Russia, the consequences would be, well, catastrophic.
And we have to think about the economic costs too, right? This conflict, if it drags on, it's going to be expensive. The sanctions on Russia, they're already having a negative impact on the global economy. And it costs a lot to provide military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. And some people argue that the U.S. needs to focus on its own problems, that all this attention on Ukraine is taking resources away from more important issues here at home.
Right. And that leads us to the question of what happens next. What are the different paths forward? What options are policymakers considering? And what could happen if they choose one path over another?
Exactly.
So one option is to just continue doing what they're doing now.
Okay.
Keep giving Ukraine military and economic help. Keep the pressure on Russia through those sanctions. That approach, it's meant to help Ukraine hold its own and to stop Russia from being aggressive again. But the risk is that it could drag the conflict out even longer and make tensions worse.
Right. And there are people who think the U.S. needs to be even more assertive. They say we should give Ukraine more advanced weapons, give them a real advantage on the battlefield, and force Russia to come to the negotiating table.
But that could be dangerous, Russia might see that as a direct threat to their security, and that could lead to a really serious escalation. And then there's always the risk that those weapons could end up in the wrong hands or be used in a way that makes the conflict spread.
Yeah.
Another option is to try for a negotiated settlement, a diplomatic solution that deals with those core issues that are causing the conflict. And that would probably mean both sides giving up something, but it's really the best hope for stopping the fighting and the suffering.
But getting a negotiated settlement, that's not going to be easy, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, the trust between those two sides, it's almost non-existent. And they have such fundamental disagreements about things like Ukraine's territory and its relationship with NATO. If you want to find a solution that works for both sides, it's going to take a lot of diplomacy. And not just from the U.S. and Russia, but from key European allies and from international organizations, too.
And the U.S., they have a really important role to play in all of this. They have influence with both Ukraine and Russia, and they can really help to make sure any agreement is fair and that it will last.
Right. And the U.S. has to think about the long-term consequences of this conflict for their own foreign policy and for their role in the world. The conflict has shown how important it is to have strong alliances, to have a strong deterrent, and to support democratic values and that rules-based international order.
It's still hard to say how this conflict will end, what the long-term consequences will be. But one thing's for sure.
Yeah.
It's changed the geopolitical landscape. It's brought us into a new era, and it's an era defined by uncertainty and by these heightened tensions.
And it's shown us how fragile peace is and how connected we are globally, both in terms of security and our economic systems. The choices we make now in the coming months and years are going to have a huge impact, and not just on Ukraine and Russia, but on the whole world.
And on that note, we encourage you to keep learning about this complex and ever-changing issue. Stay informed. Talk about it. Think about the potential consequences of different actions, because what we decide now will have a profound impact on the future. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into U.S.-Russia relations.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.